So if you really can get a clear view of where you really stand, and that could be competitively from a customer perspective, organizational capabilities, technology, a whole bunch of things. So that will vary depending upon your situation. If you get a really clear view of that, you'll start to be able to quantify better, at least, the risk of your inaction. That's the thing that I think companies often get wrong.
You're listening to Retail Remix, your inside access to candid conversations with the people shaping retail's future. Here's your host, Alicia Esposito.
Welcome, everyone, to a special episode of Retail Remix, because today we have Steve Dennis on the line with us. You very likely know Steve Dennis by now. He is an author, keynote speaker, and all-around expert on all things retail and business innovation. Today, we dig into his latest book, Leaders Leap, and not just what the book is all about, but the theory and strategy behind it. Why Steve decided to write this book now, what he learned in his process, and most of all, what experiences did he have that fueled the creation of the book. It's always a pleasure to sit down with Steve and just get his perspectives on what is driving businesses today, what are the challenges and opportunities, and I think we provide a good balance of the details of what the book is about, what the readers will get from it, but also just his general commentary on what is happening in the business and specifically retail industry today. Listen in. Steve, thanks for being on the show, my friend. It's great to have you on again.
Well, thanks for inviting me back. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, we have a lot to dig into. I mean, obviously, a lot of the folks listening, if not everyone listening, knows you, your incredible retail expertise, and all the great commentary you provide on the latest news and happenings. I don't want to say your new book, which we're talking about today, is a departure from your retail expertise and focus, but more so an expanded view of your knowledge and experience in the business world. This may be a bit of a big question to dig into right off the jump, but I'm curious, why was now the right time for you to make this move and take this expanded view of the business world?
Sure. Well, just quickly for folks that haven't read the book yet, Leaders Leap is much more of a leadership book than kind of a prescriptive strategy book, I guess, for lack of a better term. And it's not just about retail. I definitely draw on a lot of my experience in retail, and I definitely use plenty of retail examples, both because I think many readers will be able to relate to them, whether they're in retail or not, but also retail's been highly disrupted and so forth. But, I think with all my time, particularly in retail, I started my career at Sears, which most people will know was once the biggest retailer on the planet, and now it basically doesn't exist anymore. And I've worked with other retailers, both directly as well as through my consulting business, that have really struggled to change enough to keep pace with all the disruptive forces that are going on. So part of me was just kind of asking myself some version of the question of, if the world has changed so much, why have you changed so little? Because I don't think it's news that we've been going through a lot of seismic shifts for many, many years, but yet so many retailers that had plenty of advantages historically have not been able to be successful. So I wanted to dig into it in a way that perhaps is additive to, or hopefully is additive to, what others have explored before. But I also, there's a little bit of I don't know if it's irony or whatever, but I also wanted to force myself to take a bit of a leap as well and write about a subject that I'm perhaps not so well versed in or not so known for, and to write it in a little bit different way than I wrote my first book.
I love that. Thanks for setting that foundation, because I always find it's interesting to get into the vision and the goals on the writer side, right? Because I feel like we all kind of go into these projects, no matter how big or small, with an idea or a vision in mind. And it was interesting to read the book and kind of look for those synergies or correlations with some of the other work that I've seen from you, if not your first book, then your articles and, other thought leadership. So I do want to dig into some of
of the call out elements for me personally in the book, but of course, encourage everyone to read the book. We'll put the link in the show notes if they haven't gotten a copy yet. But I do want to dig a little bit into the innovator's dilemma, since this was something that you talked quite a bit about in the book, and how a lot of what Clayton Christensen, outlined initially is still relevant today, but there are some new pressures and dynamics that require leaders to do much more. Can we kind of walk through those dynamics and the barriers that are creating new dilemmas for organizations? And then, of course, if it has more of a retail lean, of course, we can focus on that.
Sure. Well, I imagine a fair number of listeners would be familiar with the innovator's dilemma, but if they're not, the basic premise of the book is that legacy companies, or incumbent companies as he refers to them, often fail to respond to major changes in the industry because they stay very focused on what historically has made them successful. So this allows new technology or new competitors to go after maybe a small piece of a big company's business, but over time use that to really end up disrupting the entire industry. So, we can think about Amazon in retail and any number of other brands that have emerged over the last few decades, frankly. So we continue to see how big companies often fail to change and respond to disruptive forces. I think what's fundamentally different today between, or, really for the last 20 plus years, probably at this point, from when Clayton Christensen put the book out, which was in the mid 90s, was that essentially the internet didn't exist. E-commerce didn't exist. Cloud computing didn't exist. Smart devices didn't exist. So there are many forces today that allow technology in particular to be adopted much, much more quickly. And there are all sorts of interesting combinations between technologies, as well as just shifting consumer behaviors, dynamics, et cetera, that cause changes to ripple more quickly. Like, we see something on social media, blow up in a matter of minutes sometimes and affect the culture, much less all the things that can happen with technology. So I think what it means is we have to accept that the innovator's dilemma continues to be real today. But the need, I guess, to aim even higher in the value you deliver to really differentiate yourself from the competition and move much, much faster, that's really what I think is the fundamental difference that's emerged over the past 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. So does this connect at all to the transformation gap that you referred to a few times? And there's a great visual in the book as well. And we may not be able to convey it verbally as effectively, but are those two things associated, or can you explain how it relates to the dynamics that we're all seeing, experiencing firsthand? I mean, you mentioned social media, and I think that's a really apt example, because one thing can go viral. A TikTok challenge, for instance, can lead to a ripple effect and not just impact what consumers are doing and sharing, but also ultimately what businesses are creating and putting to market, right? So it's a very interesting flow or domino effect. So can we talk about the transformation gap and kind of how that is a very strong foundation or basis for the rest of the book?
Sure. So, and hopefully this isn't too hard to picture, but on one axis, I basically talk about the degree of customer value that a company delivers and the distance that is created between the next best competitor. And on the other dimension is speed. And so if you think about the degree of change, the degree of disruption, innovation, whatever you want to call it, that we see typically is relatively incremental improvements over an extended period of time. That's typically what most companies do. That's part of just business optimization. Sometimes you'll see companies do a bit more significant change and do it a bit more quickly. But the problem is, if you're in an industry or a sector that's being disrupted very fundamentally, you can see a business like Shein or Temu come out of practically nowhere in the matter of a couple of years. You can see, to use a non-retail example, you could see Uber completely change the taxi industry. You could see Vrbo or Airbnb completely change the lodging industry. So in those cases where there's quite a lot of innovation and customer value that is delivered, which really puts these companies significantly ahead of the typical competition, and it happens faster than the pace of change typically in that industry, this gap can be created between those companies that haven't innovated very much and haven't moved very quickly. And part of of what I set up in the beginning of the book is not only is this gap something to really pay attention to and worry about, but in many cases, if you fall too far behind, you may never be able to catch up. And in some cases, that's more of customers have found new favorite places. But in other cases, it may be even if you have a great plan, you're not going to be able to get Wall Street or investors or your board to go along with it because it's way too expensive and way too risky. And a great retail example of that is what we've seen with department stores. Department stores have been losing market share for 2+ decades on a pretty steady basis. They haven't done anything really significantly to change the outlook. And they've fallen further and further behind, losing market share to off-price retailers and specialty concepts, as well as Amazon and a whole bunch of other people. Now they've gotten to a place where their business model, their fundamental business model, just is broken. It doesn't work. And they need a completely new business model. But what it would cost for them to abandon hundreds and hundreds of mall-based retail to do something quite different or really redesign and reconfigure their existing real estate, they're just not going to be able to get investors to go along with that. So you really want to avoid, obviously, getting to the point of no return if you possibly can. So that's sort of the negative way of looking at it, is just don't let yourself get so far behind. But the positive way of looking at it is if you really understand where customers are going, where technology is moving, where competitors have vulnerabilities, you can leapfrog into the future and create something really powerful and sustainable, hopefully.
No, that's great. And we are going to get into, I think, some of the nuances and possibly even challenges that some companies, especially, public companies, face in possibly keeping pace with consumer changes, all of the dynamics that you mentioned earlier that may be impacting industry or business disruption. But first, I do want to make sure we hit on the individual level, right? Because a lot of this is focused on leadership and the individual actions that we can take. And I do want to dig into one section that I especially liked called a confederacy of meh. If we could explain and distill some of the issues that we're seeing in retail, especially, I think that's a really, really appropriate way to distill it. But really, you're urging retailers to bring their game to a whole new level if they want to break free from mediocrity and truly become remarkable. But it did get me kind of thinking about this, right? Like my own work and the pressures that I individually face day to day as someone who is not just doing work, but also managing a team doing work, and just kind of the realities of responding to the short-term stuff, but also planning the big picture stuff, the long-term vision and strategy for a brand and a business. And I guess, it's that tug of war, right? And I don't know if you feel this, Stephen, in your day-to-day. I'm sure a lot of folks listening feel it. But I mean, how can leaders begin to kind of break free from this box that we're in, where we're just chipping away on the day-to-day stuff, right? And the fires and the urgent issues and the emails, and really do ourselves more of a service personally, professionally, and creatively, so we can kind of get that big picture, like visionary and creative work more in focus for us. And I apologize, but this is very philosophical and deep for the conversation at hand. But I just feel like this is such an ongoing pressure that so many people face in all industries right now.
Sure. Well, I think one thing, so the subtitle of the book is Transforming Your Company at the Speed of Disruption, but I think it could easily be transforming yourself at the speed of disruption. But that kind of begs the question, what is the speed of disruption? And I think that varies quite a lot. I mean, it's easy to say retail is being disrupted, right? That's a very high level statement. But when you dig down below the surface, you see that the pace of disruption can be quite different depending upon what sector we're in and where our particular company sits. And I would say the same thing about leaders and individuals. If things are changing very quickly in your domain, whether that's your personal professional domain or more broadly your company, then that just pushes you to break free as much as you can from the more serviceable, mundane kinds of things. But, every company has got stuff it has to do. I often talk about the difference between table stakes and differentiators. Like there's the stuff you have to do to stay in the game. And then there's the stuff that really distinguishes you and causes you to stand out. So the importance of being remarkable in the work we do, again, whether it's the company at the corporate strategy level, let's say, or down at our individual level, is the recognition recognition that compared to certainly pre-internet days, right? If you want to go back that far, customers are distracted. They have so much information. There's very little friction to be able to go out and find alternatives to just about anything we do. You think about as a gig worker now, right? You can be doing graphics work. Like the folks that work with me on graphic stuff, one of them's in London. I originally started working with her through Upwork. It's just a whole different game than being limited to the choices of somebody you could meet with in person or talk to on the phone, right? So I think we see this played out across so many dimensions of our society and so many aspects of competition. So if you're just a slightly better version of average, you're probably not going to get noticed in the first place. It's pretty likely you're going to get deep engagement and loyalty and be able to be successful over the long term. But I guess, my point is that's an important principle to stay focused on. But you also have to be very conscious of how much change is really necessary and how far you have to set yourself apart from the competition.
Got it. And I guess that ties to a follow-up question of sorts around, assessing and responding to risk, right? Because there are some companies that have tried to implement some really big ideas or make some big departures from the core of their brand and what their business is known for, largely in an effort to keep pace with consumer expectations, consumer demands. So they say, right? But I guess, the core of my question is that, a big part of being a leader is also assessing and responding to risk, right? So right. I guess how can leaders best determine when to take the big, bold risks and take the leap, so to speak, or whether a more slower, steadier, possibly more calculated approach is required? And I know it's hard to kind of generalize since every business is different, but any guidance, any things to consider?
Well, I would say in general, if you work at a retailer or any organization for that matter, that is struggling, and you haven't had much success putting change into place, there's a pretty good chance you have a messed up relationship with risk, that you don't realize that slow and steady kind of incremental change isn't actually the riskiest path of all. Going back to the department store example, it would have been far better to have taken more risk 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, than to keep kind of putting these incremental changes into the world. So one is, I think you have to be really honest. Part of what I argue for in one of the chapters is really kind of opening the aperture, making sure you're doing the homework, that you're really digging deep to understand your situation and kind of break through that denial. So if you really can get a clear view of where you really stand, and that can be competitively from a customer perspective, organizational capabilities, technology, a whole bunch of things. So that will vary depending upon your situation. If you get a really clear view of that, you'll start to be able to quantify better, at least, the risk of your inaction. That's the thing that I think companies often get wrong, that they look at should we do an acquisition? Should we put out a new product line? Should we test a new store format? Whatever it might be. They look at that as fairly risky, when in fact their defending of the status quo is often far more risky. So there's no one-size-fits-all answer to how to do that. I think the way you get there is to try to let go of some of your old ways of operating, get a very clear view of the data, get different perspectives, challenge your assumptions. Because, as it turns out, many assumptions that were very valid a few years ago are no longer valid at all or are becoming much more questionable. So that clear view is really important. And actually, I think mapping out the different paths you could take and trying to put some risk assessment to it. But the other thing I try to be careful to say, because one of the problems of putting leap in the title is that it may give this idea that everything has to be some sort of big, bold move. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that. In many cases, you do need one big, bold move. But in most cases, it's a series of smaller leaps. And it's a portfolio approach of trying stuff, failing fast if that's right, or gleaning the learnings from your experiments and translating those into something new. And then being willing, when something is working reasonably well, to step on the gas and kind of ante up to the next level. So there's going to be a somewhat different approach. But I think fundamentally, I would approach, if you're struggling, you probably are being too risk averse. That would be my strong hypothesis with most of these companies.
Got it. And I appreciate that nuance. I think that's important, showcasing and reaffirming that not everything has to be a big, bold move or a big leap. And I guess my follow-up question there is, are there any notable nuances or distinctions for public companies in particular? I mean, we cover the markets quite a bit on Retail Touchpoints, and it's always interesting interesting to look at and analyze these companies that claim to be quote unquote disruptor brands or disruptor businesses, challenging the status quo, right? And once they go public or once they're public for a while, it's like you almost start to see this gradual downfall. And again, hate to overgeneralize here, but you kind of look at the pattern over the past couple of years and it's pretty hard to avoid. So I guess my question for you is there anything worth noting or calling out that, public companies may in particular struggle with, especially as we consider the importance of driving not just customer value, but shareholder value as well?
No, it's a great question. And I actually had some commentary on this in the book. And for various reasons, we decided to take it out. But several people have asked me about this. I mean, there is just the reality, for better or worse, there is the reality that most leadership teams are going to be impacted in some way, shape, or form by whoever their investors are, if you're a for-profit company of any size anyway. And so if you are, say, a Macy's, it's just very unlikely that your investor group, which generally is going to be, not to get into too much Wall Street speak, but, it's generally going to be value investors that are not looking for some bold growth strategy. They're not going to be particularly interested in hearing something that would look more like an Amazon strategy of, well, we're going to invest billions of dollars and lose money for a bunch of years, but trust us, eventually it's going to be great, right? That's not something, for a bunch of reasons, that Macy's is going to be able to do. On the flip side, on the disruptor model, so many of those companies, as you would know, were funded by venture capitalists that have a lot more risk tolerance and, generally speaking, are going to value growth over profitability in the hope that they can get a big exit. And so we saw a ridiculous amount of money, frankly, go into some of these companies that aren't even close to making a profit. And many of them have seen their stocks fall by 80, 90% since their IPOs. So that's just the reality of some of the dynamics that you have to deal with. So I wouldn't dismiss them. I think those are real constraints, and they can very well, on the one hand, if you're an existing company with conservative investors, limit the pace at which you're going to be able to lead change. And if you're one of these wobbly unicorns, as we like to call them on my podcast, then you're going to tend to be valued on growth over profitability. Eventually, the underlying economics are going to catch up with you, though. I mean, I think that's the thing that always seems to sort things out, is that investors get impatient with lack of progress, and they start to see, in the case of the disruptors, that there's not a good path to profitability unless some big things change. And in the case of the more traditional companies, that if they can't start driving the top line, it doesn't matter how many stores they close or how much cost they take out.
Great. And I do want to get into part 2 of the book, because I really appreciate when books balance the theory, but also the actionable steps and tactics readers can employ. So part 2 of the book is centered on the 7 leadership mind leaps. Leap 1 is crush your ego, something I personally am big on. And I guess I'm curious, is it first by intention? Is this kind of the foundation for putting the other leaps into motion? And if not, why did you put it first?
Yeah, it's very much by design. In some respects, it's a little bit like the put your mask on first philosophy. I do think that, and maybe one thing I should say before I get into this is that as much as there is definitely elements of corporate strategy in here, and a couple of the mind leaps are much more strategic points, most of them are really about leadership values or characteristics or behaviors, where I'm arguing that leaders, in order to lead a successful transformation, need to go from one way of approaching problems and being in the world to a fairly different way. So leaping from kind of one mindset to a different mindset. And with Crush Your Ego, what I have seen with myself, because I do a little bit of personal reflection in the book, as well as, for the most part, not naming names, but seeing people that I've worked with, consulted to, or studied, where ego really is the enemy, where their protection of their legacy or their inability to let go of certain things that have made them successful in the past has gotten in the way of their ability to do what needs to be done, or just even kind of this imposter syndrome that I think many of us are familiar with, where I don't really know what I'm doing. I mean, it's definitely affected me at one point. It's affected me at multiple points in my career, but one point in particular, when I was working at Neiman Marcus, where I really felt like I didn't know what I was doing, but I was too afraid to admit it and ask for help. And as I say in the book, if you're wondering how that turned out, the answer is badly. So it's not generally to our advantage to engage in some of these behaviors. So I think if you're not able to be more humble, if you're not willing to ask for help, if you're not willing to say, maybe what's gotten me here isn't going to get me there, I think it's very hard to really be open to a very different way of leading.
Got it. And you referred to your experience at Neiman Marcus and how that really inspired you, or I guess connected to your crafting of Leap 1. And of course, there are 6 others. Beyond the first, are there any others that really resonated with you just based on your personal and professional experiences? Leaps that maybe you worked especially hard to overcome over the course of your career?
Well, one of the leaps is safe is risky. And I know we've talked a little bit about that already. But one of the things I get into in that chapter is really, for lack of a better term, slaying the dragon of fear, or seeing how fear keeps us stuck. And I think that, in my own case, where I've basically known what needed to be done, but I just didn't do it, it was often fear that got in the way. When I see companies that I've worked at or with, and again, they most often have a pretty good idea, not always, but have a pretty good idea of what needs to be done, it's the fear that kept them from doing it. The fear could be everything from, it might not work and I'm going to get fired. It might not work, I won't get my bonus. It might not work, I'm going to look stupid. There's all sorts of reasons I'm sure we can think about, whether it's why we're afraid to give a speech or whatever. But, there's a lot of things that I lean pretty heavily in this chapter on Stephen Pressfield's work on resistance. And resistance is a powerful force. And I think we have to accept that it's there and name it and see how it keeps us stuck. And then I give some advice on how to work our way through it, but it's not easy to do, particularly if we're in a culture that doesn't reward taking risks, that is going to look poorly on a failure of sorts. Most cultures that are really good at innovation and transformation really celebrate taking risk and actually reward failure, which I know some people really, I've had some people when I've talked to them about the book say, well, this idea of celebrating failure is just stupid. And I'm like, well, I don't agree. but doesn't mean, I think people get confused sometimes to say that, well, if I let go, try not to control things too much, or if I am okay with failure, or I'm willing to quit, or whatever, somehow that makes us weak. And I don't see it that way. I think done right, it's actually a superpower. So, some of that is, I've certainly been affected by my upbringing and places I've worked and people around me in terms of the way I've looked at things over the years. But I think if you look at the companies and the leaders that are more successful, most of them are quite comfortable taking risks.
So I want to dig into that point of people saying encouraging failure is, that's a stupid point, or, you shouldn't really get into that, because I feel like if you are to take any sort of risk, no matter how big or small, failure is inevitable in most cases, right? And I guess that leads to this broader question around how we can be productive when failure does happen, both at the individual level as well as the leadership level, right? Because we ourselves as humans take risk in our actions, but we also have to encourage our people, our teams, to do the same. So do you have any pointers or tips on how we can show through our words and our actions that we're not only unafraid of failure, but almost encouraged by them, right? Like kind of like the whole yes and method, right? I mean, do you have any advice for people that maybe don't think it's stupid, but like maybe have an issue letting that perfectionism or that control go, especially out of their professional lives?
Well, one thing I've tried to do in my own life is try to make more explicit. It's kind of a little bit like we were talking about risks earlier, is make explicit the trade-offs, see that, okay, like I'll give you an example today. I wrote something for Forbes. I've been procrastinating on it for like 2 weeks. And I finally said to myself, I'm just going to spend 2 hours on it and then I'm going to publish it. And what I had to say is I'm beating myself up for my procrastination. I can, it's hard to quantify like what's happened. It's not like people are sitting there waiting for me to publish this thing and somehow they can't do their jobs if I don't publish it, right? Like, so it's not obvious like there's a short-term negative impact to me. I don't have any obligation to do it. But I started to see how it wasn't serving me well to procrastinate. And I've said to myself, I want to put more short pieces out into the world. And so at a certain point, I just have to say, well, if I spent more time polishing it, maybe it's going to be better. But in reality, am I just trying to get it from being like, 92% to 93%. And what's the worst that's going to happen, really? And so I think sometimes we just have to like really make explicit the trade-offs, that the cost of our inaction on a more perfectionistic thing. But I generally think as a leader, one of the things that's most important is just to model it as much as you can, which is probably kind of an obvious point. The harder thing is if you're like, I've worked in 2 organizations, well, actually 3 organizations, where I was the most senior person responsible for doing new stuff, but all 3 cultures were not really wired to say yes and do a lot of innovation. And that, that can be a pretty lonely place. And it's a good way sometimes to get yourself in trouble with the CEO. So no matter how much we do as individuals, if we're in a culture that's not supportive, that's pretty tough. And, my advice, I guess, is that the place you really want to be, which is, easy for me to say, because the answer isn't always to quit, right? But it is tough if you're more junior in an organization and you're trying to be a radical, you're trying to be a trailblazer, you're trying to be innovative, and you don't have the support from up above, which is part of the reason why I'm really speaking in this book. Like, I hope folks outside of very senior roles will get a benefit from it, and I think they can. But I am mostly speaking to people that are responsible at the strategic and cultural level.
And one thing that I do really love about this book is that at the end of each section, you do make a point to have a series of questions or prompts to kind of ease readers through that leap, kind of reflect on it, make it more real, I guess you could say, before they transition to the next one. Why was that important to you while crafting this book? Is it because you are very much speaking at that strategic level and that's kind of a way to, again, actualize what you're talking about in the book? I mean, like looking at your experience as a leader and also someone who has had so many conversations with leaders, right? Why was that an important component to integrate?
Well, one thing I discovered in writing my first book, Remarkable Retail, was, and I'm proud of that book, so I'm not trying to like go back and do revisionist history here. But one thing I found a little bit frustrating when talking about an industry that is as diverse as retail is trying to give advice that's going to work for a very large percentage of the people who might read the book. And so I found myself probably over-explaining things and giving more examples than probably was helpful. I'd like to think some people found that useful, but trying to strike this balance between being more, for lack of a better term, inspirational and directional versus, here's kind of the cookbook for your business. It's a very hard balance to strike, even with, as I said, with my first book, with just talking about retail. Now here I am talking even more broadly. It was like, well, I can either write a 600-page book, and if you go back to some of the most popular strategy books like Blue Ocean Strategy, Good to Great, or whatever, they are filled with just dozens of examples. And most of them, I think, if you're not in that industry, they're pretty uninteresting. And it makes the book a bit of a slog, even though I love those books and I use them as inspiration for this book. So I decided, well, I'm going to try to make this book a little shorter and breezier and more inspirational, not going to be too heavy-handed or detailed with the advice, try to really point people in the right direction. But if I could craft a few questions at the end of the chapter, hopefully people could say, okay, I can take these ideas and think about how I might apply them in my particular situation. So originally it was a bit of a compromise, but I've had a bunch of people tell me they really like it. So maybe it was a good call, and I probably should credit my editor for giving that suggestion as a way to solve the dilemma.
Yeah, we love a good editor, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm not sure people realize how much editors actually do in this process. It's fortunately, I've been well supported by a lot of great help.
Yeah, no, that's great. I thought it helped strike a really nice balance between the theory and also like what can we actually take from this and how can I apply it? I think to your point, sometimes books go overboard in one direction, but I think, having that balance is really nice and keeps the reader flowing. But, I do think the book is filled with so many incredible, great insights and lessons for anyone at a strategic and leadership level, honestly. Like you said, beyond retail, but especially so just given your expertise. And honestly, I feel like if we kept digging and peeling back all of the layers within it, it would be a 5-hour conversation, but
turn into the Joe Rogan retail podcast.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not caffeinated enough for that, but maybe one day. But I guess for everyone listening, is there a cliffhanger or even better, a call to action of sorts for folks that maybe you want to check the book out, or if you want to encourage the folks listening to check the book out? What would be like the one takeaway or one big shining star, so to speak, for them to take with them?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know if I have anything super pithy. I guess in general, I feel I think this book will appeal to people that know they're stuck in some way and they've tried a bunch of things, but they're just not sure how to get to that next level. So I guess, my sense would be, or my advice would be, find those one or two things where you're stuck and just get into action. One of the things which I stole, of course, from other people is, what better time than now? In a lot of cases, it's just like going back to my Forbes article, even though that's hardly a bold leap. But, I was stuck putting out some new stuff. And I just said, well, I'm just going to get it done this morning. That's my deadline. And I'm going to put it out there. And I really believe that will, it may spur some conversation that wouldn't have happened hadn't I done it, but now it gives me a little bit more confidence to do the next thing and do the next thing. And so a lot of times these leaps, whether they're personal leaps or project leaps or creative leaps or corporate leaps, are a series of small steps taken quickly and then, leveraged to the next big leap.
Awesome. Yeah. The time is always now to take the first step, right?
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, Steve, thanks again so much for taking the time out. Really appreciate the effort and the thought in the book and definitely got a few great takeaways on my side. So appreciate you getting on the show, digging in with me, and of course, sharing some great insight and commentary into the process.
Well, thank you. It's been fun and I appreciate all the great questions.
And to all of you, hopefully we can keep the conversation going. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the book, any follow-up questions from you as you're digging in. So be sure to drop us a line on social media. We are on LinkedIn mainly at Retail Touchpoints. Of course, we'll tag Steve in the post. That way he can stay in tune with the conversation. And of course, sometimes we're on X as well at our Touchpoints. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode. We're always chatting with folks in the industry like Steve, who are elevating the conversation, bringing new ideas and innovations to market. So be sure to subscribe to the show, share your feedback in a rating or review on your preferred podcast player. Wherever you listen to podcasts, we are likely there. So be sure to hit subscribe. That way you get the latest and greatest delivered right to your device. But that is it for now, everyone. Thank you again so much for joining us. We will see you next time. Take care. Thanks for listening to this episode of Retail Remix. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on your favorite podcast player. Until next time, keep mixing it up.